On the one hand, he had to deal with the Jingos and the militarists. Congress authorized a tripling of the regular army, but lawmakers shrank from any formal declaration of hostilities. So what does Adams do? He leaves town for 4 months. In the summer of 1798, he leaves Philadelphia. He goes back to Quincy, to his farm. And he had absolutely no intention of leaving it. Abigail was dangerously ill. In fact, it was thought for a while that she might not live. So he goes back to Quincy to care for her and also to get away from this bubbling cauldron of war fever in Philadelphia. Now, in his absence, Congress adopted several harshly worded measures which historians are still debating. Were they, like Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, for example, during the Civil War, wartime necessities, or were they, in fact, a domestic war on civil liberties? First came the Alien Act, which empowered the president on his own authority to expel any foreigner from American soil whom he viewed as a threat to public safety. On July 4th, ironically, Congress passed the Sedition Act, whose terms included fines of up to $2,000 and a jail term of as long as 2 years for any American convicted of publishing writings deemed, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious, or likely to undermine the government of the United States, its chief executive, or Congress. The former, the Alien Act, didn't come out of the blue. The fact is that there were already 30,000 French emigres on American soil, and it was suspected that some of those might be taking their orders from the Directory in Paris. The Sedition Act was described by no less than John Quincy Adams as the falling of a spark into a powder keg. All of a sudden, his father had to deal not only with the prospect of war overseas, but virtual war here at home. And that's no exaggeration. One of the first explosions took the form of something called the Kentucky Resolutions, drafted by his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson, soon augmented by the Virginia Resolutions, drafted by James Madison. And basically what they said was this: as a state, we have the power to nullify any federal law with which we take exception, that we believe to be unconstitutional. The fact is that Jefferson and Madison, without knowing it, had lit a fuse that would explode at Fort Sumter. They were making the case, the constitutional case, that people like John Calhoun would pick up later on, that states were part of a loose confederation. It wasn't a nation, it was a confederation, and states had an authority to override federal law. Well, you can imagine what Adams thought of that. And all this while, he is in Quincy at the house called Peacefield, nursing Abigail. You can imagine how wrenching it was for the president. The moment he believed his wife out of imminent danger, he returned to a capital awash in partisan conflict, much of it within his own Federalist Party. This is what he wrote to Abigail in Quincy. You and I seem to arrive prematurely at the age when there is no pleasure. Certainly there was scant pleasure to be found around the Adams cabinet table, most of whose members were taking their orders from Alexander Hamilton and undercutting the president. His policy toward France and the warmongers in his own administration turned conventional wisdom on its head. At a time of maximum danger to this raw, powerless infant of a republic, the man who critics called emotionally unbalanced proved to be extraordinarily balanced. For once, his famed stubbornness rose to the level of statesmanship, as he resisted the pro-war faction headed by his own Secretary of State, a man named Timothy Pickering, who was little more than Hamilton's mouthpiece. The president was equally disdainful of what a later generation would call the Blame America First crowd of French sympathizers, for whom no amount of provocation could could justify a resort to arms. While all about him were losing their heads in Paris as well as Philadelphia, Adams kept his. When a chastened Talleyrand finally signaled a willingness to receive an American minister, Adams promptly submitted the name of a Federalist candidate, but someone who was not, I repeat, not acceptable to Alexander Hamilton. When the Hamiltonians came to him denouncing his choice, he basically called their bluff. He said, fine, if you don't like my choice, I'll resign, and Thomas Jefferson can be president. They, needless to say, piped down. Adams then went before Congress in February 1799 in a message of 4 sentences and said that he was ready to take chances for peace. Long afterward, asked to provide a fitting epitaph for his career of public service, Adams suggested, "Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of peace with France in the year 1800. Now, the Bible tells us that the peacemaker is blessed. It says nothing about him being politically popular. The fact is, Adams' action opened a breach in his party that was never healed. His reward for avoiding war with France was defeat at the polls in 1800. Political wounds were exacerbated by personal tragedies. Even as his loss to Thomas Jefferson was confirmed, Adams learned of the death of his alcoholic second son, Charles. "My little bark has been overset in a squall of thunder and lightning and hail, attended with the strong smell of sulfur," wrote the outgoing president. "Be not concerned for me. I feel my shoulders relieved from a burden. The short remainder of my days will be the happiest of my life." Well, the short remainder of his days turned out to be 25 years. And by and large, they were the happiest of his life, although it took a while for Adams, as for most former presidents, especially defeated former presidents, to regain his equilibrium. In the immediate aftermath of his defeat, for example, he declared that were he to live his life over again, quote, "I would be a shoemaker rather than an American statesman." His bitterness was short-lived. 2 weeks after he entered into involuntary retirement, the elder statesman professed delight at discovering 100 loads of fertilizing seaweed in his backyard. On reflection, wrote Adams, he had made a good exchange of honors and virtues for manure. In old age, he achieved a measure of wisdom, even tranquility, or it passed for tranquility for Adams. In the last week of his life, a small delegation of his Quincy neighbors called on the ancient statesman, 90 years old, in his second-floor library at Peacefield. The house was named Peacefield for Adams' pursuit of peace with France. They encountered a palsied, toothless, half-blind figure, in his own words, ready to go forward and meet his destiny. John Adams did not rise from his favorite armchair to greet his visitors. Yet he more than rose to the occasion when they asked him for a statement to be read at the town's upcoming celebration commemorating 50 years to the day since he and Jefferson and the other patriots of Philadelphia declared a patchwork quilt of colonies a sovereign nation. "I will give you," said the old man in a firm voice, "independence forever." His holiday toast might serve as his real epitaph, for Adams had achieved independence long before his nation did. He did as much as anyone to forge a workable government, refute the cynics who questioned the durability of popular institutions, and keep the ship of state from foundering on the rocks of homegrown faction and foreign war. What Washington knew by instinct and Adams learned through bitter experience is that virtue, though admirable, is not by itself sufficient to govern a nation. That was a lesson that would be reiterated with the second Adams, who is, if anything, even more remarkable than his father.